Hi, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation on revising the personal statement for health professions applications. I'm Dr. Amanda Dye. I'm the Director of Advising and Programs at Beyond Barnard, and I am excited to talk to you all a little bit about what it means to conduct a revision of a personal statement, what you're looking for, and techniques for kind of reviewing what you've written so far with an eye toward a larger revision. So I'm going to just share my presentation and basically just get us started. So quickly, I want to let you all know the goals that I have this evening, given that we only have an hour together, are first to discuss a little bit about what happens once you have a draft of your personal statement. I'll preview some revision techniques that I often encourage people to test out. So I'll walk you through a few exercises that you can do outside of the context of this presentation. And then we'll talk through different areas of revision, different types of revision, and I'll give you some tips for strengthening your statement's content and structure. So with that, we'll get started by talking about what happens after you have a first draft. Those of you who have been participating in Barnard's committee process this year already have at least some kind of a draft or an outline of a personal statement. So I'm hoping that you all are working from a document. And so when you have a first draft, I like to encourage folks to remember that revision is about critically evaluating the effectiveness of your writing. So what you'll hear me say if you talk to me about personal statements very, very frequently is that what you have to evaluate as a person who's putting together an application to health professions programs is not just the truth of your personal statement or how it expresses something that's real to you, but also how effectively that message is conveyed through the literal writing itself. And so I want to talk to you all a little bit today about kind of understanding ways to understand what effectiveness of the writing means. And my first piece of advice is to take a little bit of a break first. So it's really, really tough to spend a lot of time drafting and then immediately dive back in for a successful revision. I think that revision works best when you have a little bit of a distance from what you've been writing. So maybe you don't remember how you agonized over particular passages. Maybe you're coming back to it, having had a little bit of a break. It's helpful for seeing the personal statement, a little bit more clearly. I think that revision can and should address a bunch of different areas of the writing, including the content. So what you're actually saying, the structure, which is, I think, probably the thing that I tend to give the most comments about when I'm looking at folks' personal statements. Also things like tone, voice, and grammar. And so we're going to go through all of those throughout the presentation today to talk a little bit about things that you can pay attention to in each of these areas to help you conduct a really thorough revision. Revision, however, is super challenging. I know that writing is hard. Writing about yourself is maybe even harder than writing generally. And so I definitely sympathize with how tough a project this is. Revision is really labor intensive. Mostly when you are working on a personal statement, it's through a very long process of revision. It's really hard to evaluate your own writing, and it's really hard to ask for feedback on your own writing. So all of these things really do make a big challenge for, kind of conducting a thorough review of your existing writing. It's also sometimes hard because you may feel uncertainty about what you're writing about topic wise, or how well your message is coming across. Sometimes people start to feel a little bit stuck when they're in a revision process. Like, I thought I liked this idea at first, and now I don't know if I like it that much. And I also don't know exactly how I want to change it. All of those kinds of things come together, and probably tons of other things that you're also thinking about to really make it a tough process. So to get started, I like to encourage people to approach revision from a lot of different angles, to try fixing or adjusting some parts of the essay and leaving others alone, then coming back around to revising those parts that you hadn't revised before, trying to look at it from different angles and to take different tactics in revising can be really, really helpful. I think it's also super important that you keep the key goal of this piece of writing in mind. And the key goal there is to make an argument for admitting you to a health professions program. Your essay should make readers want to speak to you. That's the thing that we're trying to get across here. So as I talked about in my first writing presentation on drafting, the goal here is not to tell your complete story. You simply do not have enough room for that, or even to highlight everything that's been important to your journey as a pre-health student. Again, probably not enough room for all of that, and probably not the most effective way to structure a piece of writing. So our goal here in writing a personal statement really is to get across something about your perspective or your point of view on the profession that you hope to enter, to convince the school that you're ready to take that next step, and to convince them that you would be an interesting person to interview. So what I want to talk about in the next section is really how do you go about this, right? What are some ways that you can actually start a revision process? Where do you begin? So with that, we'll talk a little bit about a few different exercises. So as I said, I'm going to talk you through all of these. The first one is an exercise that you do need to do with a partner, but you can find a partner, outside of the context of today. So this first exercise is about understanding how well the point you're trying to make is coming across in your writing. You can do this with a very, kind and willing non-pre-health friend, and just do sort of one half of this exercise. Or if you know somebody or want to reach out to somebody who's here in this presentation, you can definitely do this as the full exercise. So the first step of this exercise is to take turns talking through your essay. So without letting the partner read your essay, and without you reading the text of your essay out loud, try to share in the space of about 2 minutes what you're trying to communicate through your personal statement. Then you switch with your partner. So each person gets to talk and each person gets to listen. And then once you've done that process of talking and listening, you want to take a moment to write down first the keywords that you think you would want to hear someone understand from your essay, and the keywords that you took away from your partner's essay. Then the third step is just to share your list with each other and to kind of try to figure out how well your lists match. So do you understand from the partner's essay, are the keywords that you wrote down similar to the keywords that they were hoping someone would come up with, and vice versa? Also, do you and your partner understand terms in the same way, right? Like, so are the keywords meaning the same thing from person to person? These are really important things to assess. I like this exercise of talking through your essay because I think it really helps you to assess your level of comfort with the content that is in your essay. So is it content that you feel relatively safe and excited to talk about? Is it content that seems really relevant to the point of the essay? This exercise is also super helpful for catching any places where maybe there's a gap in the logic or the flow. Maybe as you're trying to explain it to someone, you realize, oh, that's really hard to understand unless you know some other thing about me, in which case you can address that in further iterations. I also think that considering the keywords from both your perspective and the perspective of the reader really helps you to assess whether your intended meaning is coming across well. That's a really, really important thing because, as we know, reactions to writing are quite subjective, and people are going to be influenced in their reaction by their own world knowledge and their own experiences. So you want to make sure that, another person at least can understand things the way that you're understanding them in the context of this statement. So the next exercise is one that I like to talk about in terms of considering the level of originality in your personal statement. And this is a really simple exercise. You can either print out a physical copy of your essay and use a highlighter, or use an electronic copy and a highlight tool and highlight any sentences in your essay that could have been written by anyone else. This is kind of a shocking exercise sometimes to people, because if you're going through sentence by sentence and really evaluating whether or not anyone else could have written that sentence, it may be the case that you're doing a lot of highlighting. Why do I like this exercise? Well, because I think that seeing a lot of highlighting is really important. And it may suggest that your essay could be similar to a lot of other essays that professional programs are likely to get. It also may signal that maybe there's like not enough originality or enough of your individual perspective being captured in the personal statement. As I often say, the contours of health professions applications are quite similar from person to person in many ways, right? Professional programs want to see research experience, clinical experience, service. And so folks are coming to this application process in many cases with very similar motivations, as well as with many sort of similar kinds of experiences. And so the way that you can demonstrate originality as an applicant really is through the way that you write about and express your reactions to your experiences. I think in this exercise, if you're finding, oh, like I don't know that I'm really getting across something that seems pretty unique or specific to me, that is a suggestion that maybe you want to consider restructuring your work rather than changing individual sentences. So a different approach to the personal statement might be something that's useful if you're finding that you're just not able to communicate something from an individualized perspective. The next exercise is related to structure as well. So I think that, as I said earlier, one of the things that I talk about with folks who are applying to health professions programs all the time is the structure of a personal statement, and understanding that there has to be a balance between the level of storytelling that you're doing and then the analysis that you're enacting of the stories that you've told. I think the preponderance of the essay, the biggest chunk of the essay really needs to be focused on your analysis of storytelling rather than having most of the meat of the essay be about a story. And so, we talk about balance, but also the order in which you've presented things. Lots of different considerations around structure are really, really important for personal statement writing. So the third exercise that I encourage folks to try out is creating a reverse outline of your statement. So taking the text of your statement and in the margin next to the paragraph or in a separate document, writing down the main idea or argument of each paragraph as few words as you possibly can, right? So distilling the essence of each paragraph down into the smallest number of words that you possibly can. I think this exercise is really helpful because it's a good diagnostic for things that could be going on. So if you're finding it really hard to come up with a single succinct summary phrase, it suggests that maybe your paragraph isn't doing a lot for your argument, or maybe the paragraph is trying to do too much. You're trying to put too many things, and so you can't necessarily easily summarize those things. If you're finding that your summaries are longer, maybe the paragraph is more than one paragraph in disguise. As I noted, it could be that you're just trying to do too much in that space. You also want to think about how each of the main ideas that you're pulling out of each of your paragraphs supports your overall goal in the essay, whether the order of your arguments is logical, and whether your reader has a consistent sense of where you're going in the essay. So you definitely want to be signaling to the reader the direction that you're going as you're moving through, either telling an anecdote or a story, and then more of the analysis of why you're sharing this particular anecdote. And one more exercise that I think is really helpful for larger scale tweaks to applications, and this is an exercise that I call revisioning. I like to encourage folks to take a draft and mark up that draft to identify a few sentences where you feel like your writing is working really well. It's a sentence that seems to come uniquely from your perspective and expresses something that you think is really important to understanding your application. And then take each of those sentences and copy them into another document. And for each one of them, free write for another 10 to 15 minutes, using each one of them as kind of a new first sentence, either to the full essay or to a paragraph. It's okay if this process takes you away from your original idea. I think actually that's part of the point of this exercise. And you can repeat it over and over with any sentences that you feel like are working pretty well. Once you've generated some new material, then you're better able to kind of to put things together in a different way. So you might find that you're taking some pieces of the original essay, but interspersing them with pieces that you have written more recently through this exercise. And this is a really good way to generate additional material if you do need a pretty substantial restructuring. This also, I think, is a really good exercise because it plays up the strengths of your existing writing. You know, it's starting from places where you feel like, okay, this part is working. I like this part. This part is expressing something real and something that I definitely want to say. And then how can you proceed from those places of strength is a really good question to ask yourself. Okay. So having gone through all of those exercises, I want to talk a little bit about some things that I encourage you to keep in mind as you're going through different stages of revision. And I want to talk about that from the perspective of all of those areas of revision that we talked about early in the presentation. So the first things first, I want to talk a little bit about how to consider revising for content in particular. First, I always want you to ask yourself, does the reader get a clear picture of why the information you're sharing is relevant to this piece of writing, this argument for admitting you to a professional program? You also want to think about proportions. As I said a little bit earlier, you want your essay to be balanced. It's definitely okay to share stories in the context of a personal statement, but it's important that those stories not be the biggest part of the personal statement. And so you want to think about how much space each part of the essay is taking up, what each paragraph is contributing to the reader's understanding of the essay, and what each sentence is contributing to the paragraph. Really thinking about how well all of these pieces are working together to get your message across. It is okay, and in fact, it is almost always necessary for us to cut sentences that we love in the process of revision. Revision is tough, and sometimes you may have a way of saying things that you feel like you're invested in, or maybe it's a way that you've become really comfortable talking about your professional goals, but it may not work in the context of your personal statement. And I think it's very important to recognize that language that you're very comfortable with and familiar with in talking about your goals just may not be the right language for a personal statement. That's okay. You have the opportunity through the process of revision to think about what the best way to make each of the statements you want to make really is. When you're thinking about content, you also want to think about, the thesis, which is something to do with I'm ready to go to professional school. You want to think about, how your goals with your essay have evolved during your writing process. Is there still room for change? Are you happy with the changes that you've made already? Have you sort of adjusted your perspective in terms of the kinds of information that you want to share or the kinds of stories that you want to tell through the personal statement? Those are all good things to be asking yourself. It's also really good to kind of do a little bit of check for what your reader really needs to know or to understand about you, remembering that this is a limited space, and remembering that you want to make, a good impression on the reader. What does this person need to know in order to really understand your candidacy? As I said in my original drafting workshop, being detailed and being specific in your writing can convey your ideas in a very precise way and can help a reader to better feel like they understand your perspective. And that's really what you want. You want a reader to come away thinking, this is a really interesting person who has a well-defined perspective about their professional career. I would be excited to have a conversation with this person about their application, about their professional plans. That's the goal. When we're talking about structure, I think it's always really important to know that structural change is just a part of revision. It's always going to be there. You can't really revise without making some structural changes to your writing. And ways that structural change might happen include positionally highlighting the strongest ideas. By that, I mean bringing the strongest ideas to the beginning of the essay, or, highlighting a sentence by moving it up to the top of the paragraph. These are good ways to show the reader that you're invested in them knowing about this particular thing. You may also think about reordering some of the main sections of your writing, thinking about things like logic and flow and what's going to be most understandable for the reader who doesn't have, your internal experiences or a memory of all of the other things that are kind of creating the background for your personal statement for you. Structural change usually involves making some cuts. So there are probably going to be some places where you could get rid of something in favor of having something else. And those are often places that I will point out in folks' writing as places where cuts can be made without changing the meaning, and in fact, probably with better supporting the meaning of the essay. So I often will talk about things like cutting out dialogue. Sometimes people like to put dialogue in their personal statements when they're telling stories about interactions with other people. I find that usually just eats up a ton of character space, and it would be easier to have a sentence that summarizes the conversation if the conversation itself is that important. You don't have enough room really to do novelistic storytelling, so you've got to get creative with the space that you have. I think one of the other things that I'm most likely to say to someone whose essay I'm providing comments on, you probably are going to want to cut a little bit of storytelling in order to save room to draw out the implications of that storytelling. So as I mentioned earlier, thinking about what you want a person to take away from your story is really important to understanding why you're using that particular story in a personal statement. And so by adding implications, I mean, you can make it more explicit for the reader why I'm telling you this, like why I want you to know about this particular thing that happened, or why I'm talking about this particular aspect of my life. You want to be able to explain that to the reader through the rest of the personal statement. And then finally, you may need to strengthen the transitions between different topics. If you're kind of trying to combine some things in your personal statement, it's really, really easy to skip a step when you're working from your own individual and internal experience. And so sometimes you may find that transitioning from one topic to another is something you need to work on a little bit harder, because while it makes a lot of sense to you because you've had your experiences and you have those memories and you had the feelings about those experiences, the reader is not always going to be able to make that jump with you and fully understand it. So you always want to keep the reader in mind and try to understand from their perspective how they're going to interpret your writing. I always encourage folks to think about narrative. And when I say narrative, I don't necessarily just mean storytelling. I really mean a way of propelling the reader forward. Is the reader kind of constantly being pulled forward throughout the entirety of the essay? That's what you want. You want somebody to be following you from sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph. You always want to think about whether ideas and any evidence that you're presenting for particular ideas are going to flow logically. It can be really helpful to ask a friend to tell you whether it makes sense to them. It's also really helpful, if very, very awkward, and I know that it's not fun to do, but it's very helpful to read it out loud. You would be surprised how much you catch about, like, oh, that's a weird turn of phrase, or that I sort of stumble there. Readers will stumble there too. So you want to know those places where, okay, ooh, I need to smooth something over in the writing, or I need to clarify something in the writing. You also want to think about sentence structure and length. So having some varied sentence lengths is really, really good. You don't want to have a ton of really long sentences or a ton of really short sentences. You want there to be a balance, again, with the goal of making sure that the reader is following you every step of the way. When it comes to gaps in logic or argumentation, you want to pay special attention to things like transition words, next or subsequently, la la la. Those kinds of things can sometimes people use them to sort of bind together paragraphs that need a little bit more work to be joined together. As I said, maybe the reader isn't going to follow you there. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those places and taking a look at those transition words in particular. If you're seeing, in particular with those transition words, a lot of time words, next, eventually, et cetera, that's a warning sign for me. And I'll tell you why. Because I find that usually that's a sign that a person is trying to write a personal statement that is very bound up in linear time. And I don't think that linearity is necessarily the friend of the personal statement writer. You may not, you definitely cannot tell the entire story. And so sometimes kind of freeing yourself up to put your comments in an order that's different from the way they actually happened can help you make a more effective piece of writing. It's also the case, I find, that sometimes it feels a little bit impersonal. It feels just like, sort of walking through something in, a way that as the reader, you're not being managed as well by the writer. And so I think that's something that you want to do as the writer, really try to manage your reader and make sure that they feel, they feel why certain things are important. So when you're presenting things not in chronological order, you're able to, like I said before, kind of positionally highlight the most important ideas. And that can help your reader to get to your meaning much, much faster and to follow along with you much more reliably. Same thing with list words, additionally, etc. For those kinds of things, I start to wonder if maybe you're trying to put too many things in. And as I talked about at length in the first presentation on drafting, you definitely don't want your personal statement to just come across as a list of your experiences. You don't want it to be a prose CV. Remember that different sections of the application have different purposes. And when we're talking about a personal statement in particular, we're talking about sharing your perspective and making someone want to talk to you. We're not talking about a thorough rundown of everything you've done that's important for understanding your candidacy. That's going to be what you do with the work and activity section. So the personal statement has a completely separate job, and you want to make sure that you're honoring that and letting the personal statement do its work rather than the work of another section. When we're talking about tone, I mean things like, if you're sharing opinions, are they fact-based? Are they well-reasoned? Are they things that you expect your general readership to either agree with or find reasonable if provocative? Are you extrapolating appropriately from your experiences? Meaning, if you're telling a story and trying to draw a claim from that story, does it follow logically? Is it something that would make sense to someone who is far more senior than you in their training, in their professional life? Remembering that you haven't seen as much as the people who are going to be reading your personal statement in most cases. If you're talking about an experience that has any kind of a negative valence, how are you handling that? Remembering that it's really important, if you're talking about something like maybe part of your inspiration to pursue a career in medicine was a member of your family having a really tough experience in the healthcare system. Okay, are you presenting that in a way that doesn't, blame individual practitioners and rather kind of focuses on why that experience was so motivating for you and what are the things that you want to be able to do in your career to address those kinds of ills within the system? Again, you also want to think about the words, the literal words that you're using, taking care with word choice. I think that the revision process can often be an opportunity to take it down a notch. If you found yourself really in a thesaurus, or I don't know if y'all even know what a thesaurus is, but I guess you can, they're internet ones. But yeah, if you're finding yourself kind of running over a lot of words that are maybe not words that you would use typically, even in a professional conversation, taking some time to just pull those back and relax the vocabulary a little bit, remembering that you want to come across as an intelligent person and an approachable person. When I talk about voice, I'm meaning more, is this essay conveying things about you. So does it sound like you is a question that you can answer with willing readers who know you well. So if you've got friends or family members who you can trust to tell you, without trying to insert themselves too much into the revision process, but just to read it and say, does this sound like I wrote it? That's a really, really important kind of a gut check. You want to think about connecting with your intended readership. So trying to think from the perspective of an admissions person and think about like, okay, what could I reasonably learn about the person who wrote this essay if that person wasn't me? And you also want to ask yourself, what questions will someone who reads this essay have for or about you? This is a really, really key question, when we're talking about that concept of appealing to the reader, because ideally, you want there to be questions, right? Because you want the person to say, yes, we want to interview this candidate. We want to talk to them more. So you want to think about what are the kinds of questions that could come up from your essay? And are those interesting discussion questions? Are those things that you could see coming up in an interview? Or are they questions that might be like raising more doubts about your candidacy? You want to think about those things and really make sure that your essay is provoking good and interesting questions about you and your perspective in terms of the health professions. Before I wrap up this part, I want to talk a little bit about grammar. So some of you may know my background is actually in linguistics. I was a linguist for a very long time. And so I want to talk about this from the point of view of my many years of training. So firstly, when I use the word grammar, I'm talking about a set of conventions that some people have written into books, essentially. So prescriptive grammar is what we're talking about here in terms of like the way that something is supposed to be written, what is proper English, that sort of stuff. Those are arbitrary, for the most part, rules that people have made, I don't know, style books about. Descriptive grammar, which is what linguists do, is all about just describing how people actually use the language that they use. And so we are a people who are very open to lots of kinds of expression, but a personal statement is a professional communication, and it is a communication that has a lot riding on it. So I like to encourage people to keep in mind that while writing or speech that conforms to prescriptive conventions is not objectively better than writing or speech that doesn't, and it doesn't mean that you're smarter, and it doesn't mean that you're a better person or anything like that. Writing, and in this case, that conforms to prescriptive conventions is what's most typical in this context. Standard English, in my view, is an idealization that probably doesn't really reflect anyone's actual use of the English language. And I think that that's true for all standard forms of all languages. But most of the people who are going to read your essay are not people who spent their whole 20s being linguists. I'm very sorry. So when I talk about revising for grammar, I'm talking about appealing to your audience. I'm talking about essentially a politeness convention, presenting your writing in a way that is most likely to be received the best by the greatest number of people. And I'm talking about, essentially adapting to the context that this writing is presented in. So with that said, things to keep in mind. Check on your verbs, subject and verb agreement for number and things like that. Consistency of verb tense, particularly within the same sentence, but also within paragraphs and over time. Making sure that you don't have fragments of sentences, that is, sentences that are missing either subjects or verbs. This is definitely important within the revision process, because as you're making cuts and changing things around, you may delete something accidentally, or find that, oh, I made a cut and now this sentence doesn't make as much sense, as it used to. You want to pay attention to your prepositions, which should have objects. Pronoun and antecedent relationships are really important. So, if I mention a person and then I use the pronoun she to refer to her, I want to make sure as I'm revising that I'm not moving things around in such a way that I don't introduce her before I start using her pronouns. You want to think about sort of common alleged errors in writing. So using who for subjects and whom for objects of sentences. The distinction between less and fewer. So less is mass, fewer is things that you can count. Other kinds of quantification words people get very fussy about, so pay attention to those. Things like contractions, including possessives, those are all important things to pay attention to in the context of the revision process. I always encourage folks to review things like punctuation last in the editing process. So you should be very happy with the words themselves before you do a final pass through to make sure that your punctuation is as correct as it can be. I think that it's important just to be consistent in usage throughout the essay. So I typically use a dash for sort of asides from a sentence, a comma for a natural pause, a colon for lists or a new clause, and then a semicolon for joining related material. But there are lots and lots and lots of style guides out there online that you can use if you feel a little bit shaky. Remember that most people do not, I mean, people don't have these rules in their heads. That's why linguists have a job. That's why things are different between prescriptive and descriptive notions of grammar. But use resources that are out there to help you. Making your writing as polished as possible is a good thing because it shows admissions committees that you're taking very seriously their judgment of your writing, and simply that you don't want to give them any reason to have a problem with your essay, basically. Okay, a few final tips. Give yourself time for this process. Revision is not a linear process. It's very, very cyclical. You're going to have to do it again and again. It's a gradual process that really does need time to be successful. It can absolutely be very frustrating, and so you have my sympathies there. But if you need a break, take a break for a day or two and then come back to it. If you get stuck on one particular part of an essay, leave it alone for now and work on a different piece of the essay, remembering that you can come back, you can build cyclically through this revision process. Take breaks between whole drafts. So if you kind of do a large-scale revision, give yourself at least a few days before coming back and looking at it again and deciding whether there are more places that you want to change. I think it's helpful to get a moderate amount of feedback. The more people you solicit for feedback, the more opinions you're going to get. So be judicious in the folks that you ask, but I think it's helpful to get feedback from people who know you well and personally and people who don't. And I encourage you all to take advantage of continued resources for writing support. I am going to offer a workshop later on in March on writing about your experiences. So as I've talked about in this session and the previous one, the work of the personal statement is something very distinct from the work of writing the experiences section. So we'll talk about that in particular. And I also encourage you to check out resources for writers via the Writing Fellows. So a lot of things relating to style and stuff like that are things that you can find through there. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you all and ask if you have any questions for me. You can use hand raise, microphone, chat, anything.
Hi.
Yeah.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
More in terms of sort of revising, I think I decided that it might be helpful to do like two different stories. Do you think that would be like too much to have two stories in about like your personal life?
It can be, you have to keep in mind that it's a very limited amount of space. So I would say it's definitely okay to try, but you probably, whether it's effective is going to depend on how much space you need to tell the stories themselves, and whether then you have enough space to kind of extrapolate from those stories and draw out the implications for the readers. So I would say worth a try if you think that there's a potential in that. But then, in the process of revision, really trying to ask yourself whether or not you think it's it's giving a unified perspective, and using the space as effectively as possible.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Yeah. And there is a question in the chat about how to get feedback. So I'm happy to provide feedback on more advanced drafts of personal statements. I typically am going to focus my comments on things like structure and content. So definitely not for copy editing and things of that nature. The best way to get feedback from me is to send me an editable document, so like a Word document or something like that, via email, and I can return comments usually within about a week. And I'm happy to send comments in writing. I think that's the most efficient, rather than trying to do an appointment and get comments that way. So I'm definitely happy to meet after I've given comments, but I think comments in writing are usually the most helpful up front. Just checking the chat. Any other questions? So there's a question in the chat about materials that you should provide when asking for letters of recommendation. I think that really depends on the letter writer. So I would encourage you to reach out to letter writers to ask them about their willingness, their ability to write a strong letter of recommendation for you. It may be best to write, a relatively short email, let them know that you'd like to have a conversation about the possibility of them writing a letter of recommendation. If they're open to meeting with you, even just for 10-15 minutes, talking with them about specifically why you're asking them for a recommendation is really helpful. So kind of going beyond "you were my professor" and thinking more about, like, specifically, what do you think this person knows about you that's relevant for your professional education, professional applications. And then in the context of that conversation, if the person agrees, I would ask them what materials are most helpful for them in writing the personal statement, writing the letter of recommendation. I think that's the best way to proceed. Different people may have different preferences. Any other questions? Okay, there's a question kind of previewing the next writing workshop on the activity section. So what should the description / overall message convey? So in the activity section, you're going to be working in a much more structured manner than in the personal statement. And by that, I just mean there's more of a very strict kind of guidance in terms of the information that they're asking for you to present, and then a very relatively limited amount of space to write about each of the experiences. So in the AMCAS application, you get 700 characters baseline to write about each experience. And then in the ACOMAS and ADSAS applications, it's 600 characters for the experience. I like to encourage people to think about what is the point of including any given experience in the application for you? So, if you're talking about a particular kind of job, why is it relevant for the admissions committee to know about that job? And then making sure that what you're writing in those 600 to 700 characters, depending on your application, is getting that message across. So you're able to be much more detailed about a specific experience. You're not necessarily beholden to tell a story about each experience. You're thinking much more about, what was the kind of the context of the experience? What did you contribute? What were any results that kind of come from that experience? All with an eye toward, this should make sense to someone who's evaluating my application for a professional program. The presentation from last year's activities workshop is still on the YouTube channel, so you're welcome to check that out if you want an early preview. And yeah, Dahlia, do you have a question?
Hi, Dr. Dye. Yeah.
Right?
Just really quickly, I was just wondering in terms of the experiences that we're talking about and sharing these stories in our personal statement, if it's typical to see those same experiences or that same job resurface as maybe your most important experience in the work and activity section, or have it resurface in kind of another way in the secondaries, and if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone here has had a limited number of days on Earth and and a limited number of experiences during those days. So it's certainly the case that sometimes there's overlap in terms of just like the experiences that you're talking about. I think the really important thing in that case, so let's say you're telling a story that has to do with a job that you held, and you're also writing about that job in your experiences section, and maybe making that one of your most meaningful experiences. I think you want all of the information to be different, right? So you don't want to be saying the same thing over in each of the spaces. But it's okay if like this particular experience was incredibly meaningful to me, and so I want to get across, sort of the fullness of the meaning of this experience. That definitely comes up. It's very common for things that you've like for secondary questions to ask you about like situational things, to write about a time when X. And if you've had a job or a significant research experience or a really serious volunteer commitment, probably the experiences that you're thinking of, those examples are going to come from an experience you've written about elsewhere in the application. I think that's totally okay, as long as you're just not duplicating information from one section to another.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? For experiences such as SRI, should we include them in a separate listing or weave it into an overall research experience? Well, that's really up to you. So the way that you structure your work and experiences section is that's going to differ from person to person. So let's say you had a research experience that you did over the course of 2 academic years and also the summer in between as a participant in SRI. It would be pretty common for you to kind of describe it as a research experience. In the actual AMCAS application, you're able to do multiple date ranges. So you could have a date range for academic year 1, summer, and academic year 2, so that you could really clearly delineate the hours that you were spending per week in during each of those time periods. But I would say, yeah, so SRI is really like in particular, SRI is a funding opportunity. And so I think that you're probably going to want to talk more about your research. But, people split things up in different ways, especially as it attends to research. So there's a category of experience for research itself, but application services also make category labels for things like publications and presentations. Sometimes people would pull a publication out separately and list it and describe it separately. Sometimes people, to save space, will collapse those. And so they will mention a publication in a research entry. So knowing that you have, in AMCAS in particular, you have 15 spaces, I think you can sort of try to fit the puzzle pieces together in different ways and see what works best and what enables you to best describe your experiences. But it's very much up to you how you want to split things up, and when you want to collapse things together or when you want to split them apart. Any other questions for now? Okay, well, I'll be in touch with folks who are participating in the committee process about scheduling interviews. So keep an eye out for an email in the next couple of days. I'm super excited to continue working with y'all and super excited to continue working with folks who are not participating in the committee process, but applying to lots of different kinds of health profession schools this summer. Keep me in the loop if you have questions. Always feel free to email, and I will see you all around. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you
Dye.
so much.
Have a good evening, everybody.